Welcome to Roose's Book Club. I'm Ryan Robinson, Parent Chief, the founder of Future Leaders Bermuda.
And I am Simrit Smith, social media manager and co-founder of Roose's Book Club.
Thanks for listening. Today we're going to recap our last episode a little bit and then get into our topic of the politics of personality. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about radical heritage and the experience of racism in Bermuda and in its wider context by Dr. Eva Hodgson. We're going to explore how party politics and the black elite influenced the fight against racism in Bermuda. And we're going to talk a little bit about some examples and preview our next book. So just to recap, we introduced our second book, The Experience of Racism in Bermuda and in its Wider Context by Dr. Eva Hodgson, and gave insight into who she was, an educator, a journalist, an activist. We talked a little bit about how Bermudians' tendency to focus on how much better or worse race relations are in Bermuda to the United States. However, racism, according to Dr. Eva Hodgson, is any action, policy, ideology, or structure that works to the relative disadvantage of one group or people over another, and it needs to be discussed. Dr. Eva Hodgson gave us several definitions of racism to consider, including institutional, structural, procedural, systemic, and ideological. So we'll encourage our listeners, if you didn't catch last episode, to have a look on our YouTube page, Future Leaders Bermuda, search Roose's Book Club, or go on Instagram on our social media at Roose's Book Club to learn a little bit more about the past episodes and catch up to speed.
So what I really liked about the last episode is how we talked about racism in Bermuda, like how it manifests. You guys brought up so last episode we had our other member of the Roose's Book Club, Sierra Barist, and you guys talked about like how public funds were unequally distributed in our education system. Then you had the desegregation of schools happening, and so white institutions had a head start on a financial level with receiving more funds, more government funds, how it gave them their start, how it put them in a better position. We talked about the disparities in the perception of different kinds of professions. So that link between white schools or private schools now having a better education system, having more opportunities, more networking, how that bleeds into the different types of profession and sort of like that blue collar versus white collar in jobs. And then how that perception translates to people in those jobs having more value, right? So we encourage our students and our kids to go into insurance. We encourage them to go into accounting and these corporate institutions. And we kind of like associate that value to the actual people working in those jobs versus those who are doing trades, those who work with their hands, jobs that don't make as much money, you know. And we got into the profiling and over-policing of low-income neighborhoods in Bermuda, and particularly black boys. And all of these examples of racism in Bermuda, no one really kind of gets into it because, again, like you said, right, we always try and hold or make comparisons to what's happening in the U.S.
Now, what we missed in the book is how Dr. Hodgson gives a short historical account of how slavery took roots here, the laws put in place to further oppress enslaved persons in response to rebellions, and the continued fight towards freedom after abolition. However, a shift occurred also as Bermuda entered into an era of desegregation and stronger voting rights throughout the 60s and 70s, particularly when the black population came enfranchised. And when I say enfranchised, I mean had the right to vote. What we talked a little bit about at the tail end of the last show, which we're going to get into today, we've talked about all the race and the racism and the explicit examples. But Sam, what we really want to get into is how after that desegregation era, when we achieved at least, let's say, equality when it comes to the vote, party politics became the focus of many black Bermudians instead of continuing that push to end racism and inequality. So the whole idea is around that 60s and 70s movement, you get the Progressive Labor Party, you get the right to vote, you get the civil rights movement, you get desegregation, and all of a sudden, blacks and whites were mixing, at least in law. And the idea that Dr. Eva Hodgson puts forward is because of that shift and that voting enfranchisement of the black population, party politics sort of dominated the discussion as opposed to the racism, the inequality, the systemic injustices. So her entire critique was that the founders or the members, the participants in the political scene back in that day looked to the West and looked to Europe instead of Bermuda to develop the philosophies and ideals. She mentions on page 25, black Bermudians saw racial segregation as a consistent evil. And so for black Bermudians, racial integration was the solution. As a result, we stopped talking about the systemic changes that needed to be made and focused a little bit more on that desegregation element and then shifting into the party politics. So when we talked on the last episode, we talked a little bit about how has party politics impacted the black community in Bermuda today? Mm-hmm. Has it caused a schism? Has it caused division within the black community that is actually distracting us from systemic racism and some of the other changes we need to make for a productive society and a unified society?
Exactly. So that leads us into today's topic, and it's it's the personality, the politics of personality. The politics of personality is what we're diving into today. So in sort of like starting from where you guys left off, black Bermudians equating the end of segregation and the start of integration as the path forward to moving into this era of post-racism and oppression, you start to see how politics becomes the topic of focus. And she talks about how that influence actually comes from even what we're seeing in other areas of the world. And what was happening in the U.S. With labor unions, with universal franchise, with
left versus right,
and capitalism. And it was interesting because she talked about how, like, black Bermudians, the average black Bermudian didn't even know what those things were. They didn't understand how that really related to what they were experiencing, what was causing them hardship, the issues that were really of a concern to the general population of black Bermudians. But these were our black leaders at the time. Our black leaders were the ones that were driving conversation around issues on a legislation and policy level. And so we see this development and this this surgence of party politics, right? Mm-hmm. One of the bigger or most popular ones were the PLP, the Progressive Labor Union. And so they were the ones who, black leadership at the time was the ones kind of driving this force of like, it's party politics that is going to get us into the next phase. It's party politics that is going to uplift and fight for the people, right? And it became this narrative that a lot of Bermudians started to buy into, and it kind of like gave the people this hope, right? Like, this is the way forward for us. This is how we're going to make our lives better on a day-to-day basis. And I feel like we've seen how much that didn't work. That ended up not working out for us.
Well, that's the debate of the day, right? And so it's funny, they say history repeats itself. I think we never really progressed, to actually tell the full story. So you had the Progressive Labor Party win in 1998. You had the final stage of when it comes to at least electoral and voting equality with single seat constituencies. And so the PLP was able to deliver that change, right, after 1998, and making sure that at least across constituencies and the voting districts, there was equality. There was one candidate, there was one man, one vote. So when we look now at segregation, desegregation through to 2024, we have to ask ourselves now, well, now that we've achieved that equality in the law, what is the focus when it comes to the Black Bermuda community and driving change for all of Bermuda, right? When we look at these, I guess, concepts of lower versus middle class, when you look at the educated Black Bermudian, when you looked at ideologies of whether that's the Progressive Labour Party or even Black leadership in other parties today and other groups, we have to question, the Westminster system and the changes we've made within that system to date. And I think that's sort of what Dr. Eva is speaking to, because she's saying, well, have we focused so much on the personalities? Have we focused so much on the parties that we actually have dropped the ball when it comes to driving the changes that we need to see? And so the title of today's episode, The Politics of Personality, is actually speaking to some of the direct quotes in Dr. Eva Hodgson's book, because her argument is we didn't really focus on the policy. Now, the Black leadership of the PLP, I don't want to say they didn't, because there were definitely some agenda items that had to be delivered when they first got elected in 1998, such as what I just mentioned with equality when it comes to voting, single-seat constituencies. And there have been some other, things that were looked into around education and race and different groups set up and different working papers. So I don't want to diminish that. But the point Dr. Hodgson is making is for the entire Black community, not just the PLP base, not just working class versus blue collar versus upper class versus white collar, the entire Black community, when you look at it as a whole, has the idea of the Westminster system, the party politics, has it centered so much on the personalities involved that we haven't actually taken the time to discuss the policies, the ideologies, the concepts, the systemic changes. So when we look at the Black leadership we've had over, let's say, the past 20 years, we have to ask, have the Black leadership done the work to come up with these policies and ideologies that actually uplift the community? Or have we aspired to simply emulate what we think Bermuda should be under a Western, white, Westminster system lands, right? Whether that's as a British colony, whether that's economically as a tax haven and international business. The general concept is, when we look at our Black leadership, how much have we chosen them based off of personality, whether we like them or not, versus what they are actually delivering in terms of changes to the system?
What is most interesting to me as I read through this book is Dr. Hodgson's focus on the division that it has created within the Black community. She, like I said, the book starts off actually out with her giving us a brief history on how racism has developed in Bermuda as a system, like systematically. So she talks about slavery starting on the island. She talks about how laws and policies and legislation has come about in response to a lot of the rebellions and uprisings that happened throughout the years, right? And so she kind of sets the stage in the beginning of how politics and policy have gone right along, hand in hand, with how racism has manifested and developed in Bermuda, especially on a systemic level. And when she critiques party politics, it is about that division that it's created within the Black community in Bermuda, particularly because she talks about how it distracts from the issues, the real issues that we faced throughout our history, that we're facing today. And I had never really thought about it before reading her work, because I think, one, it's hard to be able to deconstruct things when it is systemic, right? Because you're just used to it. This is how it is. But the second thing is that it's really interesting how the division has played on personality, because it doesn't talk about policy. It doesn't bring up how are we going to look at the issues that we are facing and then try and prioritize what it is that we need as a people.
So before you even get into the personality part, because you said a lot there, I just want to walk back a little bit to a key point you just made, which is the focus on the personality, the focus on the party, the focus on the politics, right, has been a distraction from the actual advancement of the people, right? So I want to start there before we even get into the personality aspect, because what you're speaking to just now is the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of actual change as a result of these distractions, right, as Eva Hodgson would call it. So I want to give an example just for the audience, just so that we're trying to connect the dots here when we say how party politics or the Westminster system and our leaders' conformity to the system and belief in the system has led to perhaps some distraction and inability to deliver, right? So on page 22 of Racism in Bermuda and in its wider context, Dr. Hodgson uses the example of the vote and widening the franchise. So just as a recap, for those who may be unaware, prior to the middle towards the end of the last century, the voting system in Bermuda had a lot to do with whether you owned property. It was mostly white Bermudians that had land. It was, they had the property vote. It wasn't one man, one vote of equal value. And so we had to lobby for that change, right? And so Dr. Hodgson uses an example where the black politicians of the day had been lobbying for years to widen the franchise using the conventional and constitutional methods. So specifically, she refers to the Honorable W.L. Tucker, a black politician who had lobbied for years. 20 years earlier, Dr. E. Can had lobbied to obtain the vote for rent payers. David Tucker and Dr. E.F. Gordon were both long associated with the universal franchise. And she says that even after 18 months of discussion, the biggest concession that was given to these respected politicians was a promise to contain syndicate voting, and then after only 2 months, some of the strongest white opponents to the universal franchise were yielding major concessions to black youth, which in the first instance had been labeled communists. So she says that when black politicians or parliamentarians back in the day negotiated with white committees or around the table, sort of through that political system, they didn't achieve very much, and it even took a very long time, the little that they did achieve. But, she, and I quote, when black people acted together as a collective group without negotiation, they had then seen a bigger response, right? However, she says, at the bottom of page 22, black politicians were so anxious to follow the methods of the Western and the white world that they would eventually throw away the most effective tool, which was collective action in favor of the white method of a few making all of the decisions to the exclusion of the general population. And she uses the example of a group of young blacks led by none other than Roosevelt Brown, who this book club is named after, who had appealed to the actual community and the people and gained in 2 months, right, what the elected black politicians hadn't gained in almost 2 years. So that's just a very clear example there when it comes to Paulu Kamrakofego and the campaign for the franchise and equal votes and equal rights. The effectiveness of those young black people like Roosevelt Brown and his crew, right, and his gang of, I'll call them revolutionaries and young rebels, right? They at the time were able to achieve more in terms of applying pressure and resulting in that change than the established, black leadership at the time who were, let's say, having the dance in terms of within the system, within the constitutional framework, trying to lobby, trying to negotiate and sit around the table. So that's just one example from back then of her point where the focus on the politics operating within the system, the whole party, this party versus that party, this leader versus that leader, has distracted from what a few young, bright black minds with a bit of courage, right, and some gusto were able to do in a matter of months just by applying that pressure.
And for me, it comes back to what we talked about. It comes back to doing the work. When we look at politicians of the past right up until today, we see this lack of understanding Bermuda's history and Bermuda's fundamental needs at the core, because they haven't taken the time to really study, to really examine what it is that Bermudians need without the ideology of trying to use those Western systems to achieve it.
So that's a big claim. So I want you to elaborate on that a bit more, because what I'm hearing is what you're saying is that the average or in general, Black Bermudian leadership have not studied, researched, formed, I guess, conclusions based off of looking at a non-Western angle. Is that what you're saying?
I am making that claim based on what we've read and talked about through Dr. Eva Hodgson's work. And the reason that I make that claim is because you can see it in their focus on their policies. So, for example, when she critiques the political parties of her day, they focused on labor laws. They focused on capitalism. Mm-hmm. Capitalism. They focus on the universal franchise, and like she says in her books, the average Black community didn't even know what those things were. They were trying to push issues, and they were discussing issues that did not necessarily hold Black Bermudians back in those days. So regardless of your financial situation back then, she said the biggest threat to Bermudians at the time was white managers who would not give them opportunities. The biggest threat was issues that Black Bermudians faced in terms of buying homes, in terms of being able to access different opportunities. Mm-hmm. And so that was regardless of your financial situation. If you were a middle-class Bermudian, if you were elite, everyone kind of faced the same issues. Mm-hmm. And here you had political parties who not only focused their efforts on issues that were happening elsewhere in the world, mm-hmm. but they also didn't want to address the issues that were happening on the island. And we'll go to page, I believe it's page 24. It says, most Black Bermudians did not understand universal franchise or socialism and were terrified of communism. They did understand racism, segregation, and economic exclusion. Even more destructive to the Black community was the fact that the story of Bermuda's experience of racism ceased to be about the victims of injustices and their struggle for a more just society, and became the story of the party and the struggle for a limited amount of individuals seeking power and influence within the party.
That's very interesting. I mean, I'd be curious to hear the opinions of some of the Bermudians back in that time and what they thought about what the leadership were focusing on, because I do think a lot of the struggle was about that integration, breaking down that racial barrier and having access, right? Whether that's access to the right to vote, access to the theaters, I guess what you're kind of speaking to is a lot of the focus was more so about the integration aspect. Mm-hmm. And then when it wasn't about those day-to-day issues, it was, I guess, a lot of the ideological speaking vocabulary at the time, but not so much on the real deal as it affects, Bermudians, whether rich or poor, Black Bermudians. Mm-hmm. But I mean, when you made that claim about politicians today not doing the work or not doing the research, I thought of maybe more recent examples as opposed to using just that example from back in the 70s. Because even when you look at the leadership today, it seems like the extent to which we hear about race is kind of banging on that same old drum that I think it's something that is familiar, particularly among the senior population. Mm-hmm. Like it's that same march to justice and freedom type, speech. Like I remember from the rallies when I was younger, right? Like it was cool back then because it was still very much relevant, I guess, for particularly like my parents and grandparents who grew up in segregation. And so it kind of rings a bell like this lifelong struggle for integration, for example, or to break down the, use of the N-word or, just very explicit examples of racism. But I don't think the discussion in today's political scene has moved much beyond that when we talk about race.
Exactly.
And it's like, if you're not hearing about that, then they're not talking about race at all. Mm-hmm. When are we talking about race in biases, and education and levels of attainment within the corporate sector and the C-suite level. When it comes to wealth distribution, that's what I'm thinking of when you make the claim that Black Bermudian leadership have not done the work. Because I just wonder, there are definitely some that have done, some of them like, the late Walton Brown, there are some that have written the books and they've read. So there's a crop that has done that work, I think. But I guess the question is, when we look at where we are now, how many of our Black leaders, and I'm not just referring to PLP, I mean across all of the parties, non-parties, whatever they are, right? How much of the Black leadership could you kind of sit down with and have this type of conversation that we're having now? Would the contribution to the conversation go beyond just in-your-face racism? What do they think about the Westminster system? What do they think about a different political system for Bermuda that goes beyond just left, right, OBA, PLP, white, Black? We haven't really heard that among not just the current MPs, but even in recent years, even those vying for candidacy. Where's the depth of discussion on race, colonialism, the current system? Have we just totally accepted everything as it is and are now trying to, I guess, be masterminds within how to manipulate and use the current system, as opposed to exploring new ones?
And this is where Dr. Hodgson's critique of party politics rings very true, because she talks about how with creating the parties, it does and has to focus on personality, because now you are vying for power, you're vying for that individual seeking power, versus actually tackling the issues, the core issues that not even just ones that affect Black Bermudians, but ones that really challenge how is Bermuda going to move forward in general.
I want you to speak a little more on that. But before you do, I want to just read the sentence at the bottom of page 24 on Dr. Hiva Hodgson's book. She says, challenges to the white community and its racist practices were replaced by conflicts and quarrels between Black individuals and their drive for personal power. The struggle for power and influence for the individual replaced the struggle for justice for a now divided Black community. That is, to think that this was written over a decade ago, referring to something back in the 70s and 80s, and the fact that that is still relevant now is just, where is the depth of that discussion? Why aren't we talking about this? She even gives an example of not just the personal power, desire, the personality aspect of those vying for leadership, but she also talks about the Black Bermudians who were excluded and left out as a result of not wanting to be dealing with all of that, right? She says, for the Black community, party allegiance also meant that many intelligent, disciplined, successful Black individuals were prevented from contributing their much-needed skills and experiences to the country because they didn't belong to either in-crowd or either party. So ultimately, I think we have to ask ourselves, if this was written in about a time in the 60s and the 70s, where are we in 2024 as it relates to the Black community and Black leadership? Do the best and brightest among us have a place in leading the country and the community? Do those that are leading us now have an understanding of that history? Do they have a viewpoint on a different system? Do they have a viewpoint on the economic policies of the 70s, of the 80s? What do they think about international business and its impact on the Black community, positive and negative? What do they think about the place of the Black Bermudian male or woman? Where is that depth of discussion? The only time we seem to discuss race is when we bang on that same little drum about things that affected us in the 60s and the 70s, and the two Bermudas, and the segregation. Like, we're all about that as if just we close that chapter and we're just remembering it now.
Exactly.
As opposed to the actual depth of discussion on where we are today and what the current leadership What are their original thoughts?
Mm-hmm. And this is where the division really comes in, because it splits. It splits. Not only does it isolate Black intellects or those who are educated and successful when they don't align with either party or whatever parties that are present, but it also kind of divides like who gets to be highlighted in the conversations that they have. So it's like this group of people's needs are neglected, this group of people's needs are elevated, and the entire conversation, there's no space for the entire conversation to have, because once you're part of a party, it's like you have to take on not just their personality, but you have to take on their entire rhetoric, and there's no room to challenge those issues and those topics, because like we see with Dr. Eva Hodgson and her experience, the real problem is that it isolates our truth seekers. And
Dr. Hodgson was very much isolated up until her unfortunate passing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was something, even me, I mean, I grew up obviously in a totally different time from Dr. Hodgson. And one thing I regret, I mean, I never got the chance to really have a proper talk with her. You know, I would consider her a friend because she came and supported future leaders. She viewed our ceremony. She was quite pleased with the curriculum. You know, we used her on our T-shirts, and she was the theme for 1 year. And thankfully, we were able to do that while she was still alive, right? Mm-hmm. So I didn't get to have that full discussion with her. But even I knew at my young age that Dr. Eva Hodgson growing up was like this person on the side, this pariah, this figure that's like, oh, Dr. Eva Hodgson. Like, despite all her contributions, she was not in the in crowd of Black leadership. Mm-hmm. She was not, I mean, obviously not on the white side, right? Because of all of her criticisms, but not even on the Black side. You know what I mean? So you already had a large segment of the population that absolutely hated her and thought she was stuck in the past and, you know, really clearly didn't read these books, right, to see her actual dissertation on the experience of racism in Bermuda. Not just her experience, but she's really broken down effects and policies which we see today, right? Mm-hmm. So not only did we not take the time to read that and research it and really grapple with her discussions and arguments and points, as opposed to attacking her as a person, but even our Black leadership have not and did not properly give respect and honor to her, right? I know for a fact that she has been recommended as a national hero in the past. And as you can see, she is not a national hero as an accepted one, right? So it's very clear, and you know, it's beyond debate that even somebody like this with a doctorate degree back in that age, somebody who's contributed so much in terms of her writings, her opinion pieces on Black leadership, was not accepted. She was not popular. She was not liked. So that right there is a prime example of that exclusion. And I wonder, when she refers to this exclusion, and she's describing it in the book as if it's a third person thing, I really wonder if she's, you know, thinking about herself when she writes this in the book to say, you know, many Black educated intellectuals that would be willing to help lead and be a part of this change had no place. Now, with that being said, you know, we're going to talk a little bit more about the present day impacts. I think there's a lot that the community probably has to add to this discussion.
Yes.
And so we'll continue this discussion after the break, the politics of personality. And when we get back to it, we'll talk a little bit more about its impact on the Black community.
And we're back live for Roose's Book Club show. We finished off by discussing Dr. Eva Hodgson and how party politics, she found herself isolated in the political scene of Bermuda because with the focus on personality being the driver of Black leadership in her day, when she showed up and was challenging not only just their ideologies, but challenging how systematic racism has to be the focus and these are the issues that have impacted Black Bermudians the most, it caused a lot of people not even just to be in opposition and anger of her, but it caused them to kind of like shut her out of the scene altogether. And before we get into the discussion further, we do want to open the lines to everyone to chime in and give your opinion. So the
297, yeah, 297-1075. We're talking about the politics of personality and how the impact of party politics and the Westminster system has played out specifically when it comes to division in the Black community and perhaps a distraction from the real work, as Simbrit refers to, of our leaders and our community studying, analyzing, questioning the policies, the systems, the structures that shape Bermuda today.
So in turning it towards us as a people, we have selected our leaders based on their personality, their aura, their charisma, right? Everyone's concerned more about the public face of our leaders, about how they're going to show up in front of a crowd, more than we'd be concerned about the substance of who they are and the substance of their policies.
Why do you say that?
I say that because even when we look at our politicians today, who we have voted in and who we are displeased with is based on how they have shown up as a person, instead of actually looking at what they want to implement for our nation and how they go about making the laws and decisions that they do. So if we take a look at the PLP party, for example, a lot of Bermudians have fallen out of favor with them, not just because of what they have failed to do as a party, but also how we feel about them in general.
I'm trying to develop the thought because I'm now trying to make a comparison with, say, UVP/OBA. And from their time in power that I remember, at least the OBA, that short stint, in the last decade, we focused a lot more on policy and the impact of any proposed changes or laws when we had, I guess, white leadership.
I see where you're going with this.
But when you get what I'm saying?
Yes.
I'm trying to grapple with your argument. Your argument being that we focus on personality and how we feel about the individual leader as opposed to unpacking what they're actually doing or proposing to do. So when I compare, I can only speak for my lifetime,
right?
But I question now, let's go back to 1900 through to 2000, right? Let's go back to the last century. When we have Black leaders speaking, are we listening to the substance of the ideology and the viewpoint of where is their mind, where's their thought, where's their perspective coming from when they say what they say? Or are we just listening because, okay, I like listening to that person, right? As opposed to when we have, let's say, white leaders on the podium. Yeah, maybe we don't like them, but we're also digging deep right into what's the impact of, pathways to status. What's the impact of this change to the education system? What's the impact of this new policy that they're proposing, whether that's immigration or ownership, right? I remember now from that 2012 to 2017, we were digging deep into those policies and writing columns on the impact of it. Now, when I think about conversations I have with people today when we talk about Black leadership, can I talk to my friends about how the impact of, selling condos in Hamilton to foreigners will result in a different outcome for the everyday Bermudian? Do we have discussions on universal health care and whether that's preferable to insurance? And, do we have a conversation on immigration policy and what we think about international business and work permits and C-suite? I don't think so.
Because for me, it makes me examine and question, how is it that we, as Black Bermudians, show support and challenge our own leadership? Mm-hmm. How, when we look at those we have selected to be in power, and for those that we kind of rally behind and support, is it more focused on the fact that they look like us, and so now we just have to automatically be behind them? Is it because we ourselves also need to examine our own, our own ideas of what we want in our leaders? Are we expected to challenge them in the same way that we would white leadership? Because do we feel like the stakes are different when we have Black leadership and when we have white leadership in? And I feel like we don't get into that conversation enough, because it makes us sort of get into that internalized racism, right?
Okay, hold up.
Okay.
Because some key words are coming to mind, right? Again, the lines are open, 297-1075. When I heard you speak just now, some of the words that come to mind for me, accountability, because, and standards. Do we hold our Black leadership to the same standard as white leadership? Because if we have shown that we are capable of critiquing ideology, policy, all of that through when there are white leaders, why then does the level of debate and conversation descend to personality when it comes to our Black leaders? Mm-hmm. And I stopped you when you said internalized racism, because I do think that is the answer to the question. I'm turning it back on us, because if I'm going to hold a white leader to such a high standard that I'm going to unpack their policies and their impact and the systemic and all of that, but when there's a Black leader, the convo descends into this tit for tat about whether I like you or not, what does that say about how I view myself? What does that say about how I view my group, right? Whether that's ethnic group, whether that's racial group, whether that's my political party, or the people in the room with me, whether that's at Central Committee or whatever meeting you're having with those leaders, or even in the union context, right? Mm-hmm. If I'm afraid to challenge my own leaders, or if I am not even willing, or if I don't even want to challenge them because I'm just eating up everything they say and amen and amen, what does that say about the standard I hold my own community to? Mm-hmm. Is it automatically less than because they're Black?
And this is where the wider context that Dr. Eva Hodgson is talking about, right? Like the title is Racism in Bermuda and its wider context. And I think ultimately what she wants this work and this writing to do is for us as Bermudians to challenge ourselves on how racism has really shifted our ability to self-reflect on ourselves, and how that manifests in our leadership, how that has manifested for us even trying to decide on what we need as a people to move forwards, right? And this is where the question, what's missing from the conversation of racism, this is where I have been able to reflect for myself, because it comes down to what do we value and how do we allow that to influence what we prioritize, right? When you talk to the average Bermudian of the things that affect them day to day, policies, you're talking about schools, jobs, careers. We don't want to really dive deep into how we think about each other, how we think about ourselves. It really does come down to the value. It really does come down to who do we prioritize, who's more important in how these resources are allocated. So when we talk about international business and when we talk about housing, right? And we're appealing, when we talk about how Bermuda appeals to foreigners more than it appeals to its own, to me, that brings into the question of value, right? We value others over ourselves, and we have to ask why. Mm-hmm. For me, racism plays such a big part in that conversation, because we know that when you think of Bermuda, when you think of Bermudians, it's black people that come to mind.
Mm. I think we need a whole nother episode on that one. We've spent a lot of time talking about the impact of internalized racism. Let's say it's called the white gaze or the white lens, or how we match up mm-hmm. ourselves in comparison to the Western world, right? The mm-hmm. white world, within the system that we have. We spent a lot of time talking about how the focus has been on personalities, right? Mm-hmm. I want us, as we come to time, to think a little bit about, well, what might be a solution? I know that the purpose of, Roose's book club is not always to jump to solutions, right? Mm-hmm. This is a journey, as mentioned in previous episodes, that we're going to unpack over the course of many episodes as we get through each book. But what is the reverse, Simbrit, of the politics of personality?
It's clear in Dr. Eva Hodgson's writings that she outlines the reverse of party politics as collective effort. And she gives several examples throughout Bermuda's history. For example, she brings up the progressive group. Right? She says that in their organization of the theater boycott, they were able to do in 2 weeks what black legislators and leaders could not do in 2 years. Mm-hmm. And on page 26, it's on page 24. On page 24, she says the success of the CUAS and the progressive group was due to the collective action of a very large percentage of the black community. And the initiators were not seeking personal power because they were unknown. So when you see the progressive group, when you see the efforts of Dr. Paulo Camargo-Figo, who led on the voting rights.
And he was known, mm-hmm. but I think the difference that you're speaking to is that ability to have that community and collective action.
Exactly. It's not to say that we don't need black leadership at all when we have these collective efforts, but it's really about building up community, and it's really about us as a people coming together, deciding on an issue, working together in the majority to tackle an issue. So if we were to, say, wanting change in education, what does a black collective look like? Mm-hmm. Or a Bermudian collective look like mm-hmm. in getting those changes done, instead of simply relying on a handful of legislators to solve this problem?
Mm-hmm. Or outsourcing the expertise.
Or outsourcing, mm-hmm. because that's been our approach for how many years now mm-hmm. of, we have an issue in Bermuda. It's affecting everyone, and we look to our leaders as the sole solution mm-hmm. to solving a collective problem.
And I mean, I like that you gave those examples, and Dr. Hodgson gave those examples, because it proves that it's been done before, mm-hmm. and therefore it is possible to do again, right? Mm-hmm. So when we look at Roose, Paulo Camargo-Figo, and who Dr. Hodgson refers to as a group of young, black, progressive minds, where are they today, Because these were people who, I guess you could say, built their name outside of the political party system, right? These are not people who started by running for office and then you saw what they did. Mm-hmm. These are not leaders who, declared their candidacy and then you had to guess or figure out what they were about. You know, the Paulu, these are people who from young were building community, were discussing these topics, right? And their achievement in politics was a result of that. It wasn't the cause, the start of it. Their journey, that was the culmination. And Paulu even, he's been thrown out of parliament, right? Because that wasn't his starting point. He had a name before that, right? He built these things before going into politics because he had ideology, he had standards. You could grapple with him on his views, and you didn't have to wait for him to get on a podium and declare that he was running for office before you figured out what he was about. And that's where I ask, well, where are those young black people today? They're not necessarily going to be blue collar like they were back in the day, but I don't think we're necessarily going to get them out of international business either. So where are the Paulus of today? Those are the ones that are known, right? But even with the progressive group, they were anonymous. Where are the progressive groups, the young black change makers, and they weren't all black either. At some point we'll talk about the community, the white community's responsibility in this, but obviously the focus is, the impact on the black community in the context of racism. But you make an excellent point, Simbrit. The reverse of the politics of personality is the community and collective effort. And so we would encourage as a takeaway our audience to reflect on that as we come into what everybody knows is about to be silly season. So I'll leave it to you, what's the wrap up for today and what do we have to look forward to, and how can persons who are listening for the first time pick up on the journey?
So for me, the takeaways for today really do challenge us to examine how racism influences who we value, and what we prioritize, and to do the work in learning how it is that we can be a collective again, how it is that young black progressive minds, Bermudian minds, can really work, how we can work together to tackle the issues that we face as a community and to get back to community. That's the only way we're going to really be able to dig out of the issues that we have going on today. And to remember that when it comes to party politics, when it comes to black leadership that we have today, it's okay to be a truth seeker. Like, it's okay to not have to align yourself with one or the other, but standing firm on who we are and what we believe in does come at a price sometimes. And we have to really look at what we're willing to risk as individuals if we really do want to go down that road.
And on that note, don't get distracted. Thank you for listening. This has been episode 4, The Politics of Personality, Roose's Book Club. You can find us on social media at Roose's Book Club. That's ROOSESBOOKCLUB. You can also look us up, www.futureleaders.bm/Roose's Book Club. And for those of you listening, on our next episode, we're going to get into the next book, Destruction of Black Civilization, where we'll tie in these concepts produced by Dr. Hodgson with the global picture when it comes to the black world. The next episode is scheduled for September 25th. But if you go on our website, roosesbookclub.bm or futureleaders.bm/Roos's Book Club, you'll see our updated schedule and how to join in. So thank you very much for listening. Until next time.